You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of Indications, a podcast series by the Conference Board. I'm Sara Murry, Managing Director International of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast. Today, the conversation will focus on the Ukraine-Russia crisis, looking at the business implications. I'm delighted to welcome back Samantha De Bendern. Samantha spoke last time on some of the macro issues and is an associate fellow at Chatham House and has recently joined Lowe as an associate to build Lowe's consultancy in specialist areas such as countering disinformation, as well as supporting Lowe's strategic communication work with its client NATO. Welcome back, Samantha.
Glad to be here.
So, we've seen the recent sanctions from the US and Europe. The White House has threatened further extensive economic sanctions in response to Russian actions. And although many in the West may initially cheer this outcome as righteous punishment to Russia, that prospect all but guarantees that the conflict will not come to an end with an invasion of Ukraine. What's your opinion, Samantha, of the scenarios that are likely to play out?
Well, the most worrying scenario is, of course, Russia deciding to stop exporting foodstuff both to the EU and to the rest of the world. And this could happen for two reasons. This could happen because they want revenge over sanctions, and also because they need the food at home. So just to remind listeners, I'm going to talk about global issues here, then I'm going to center on Europe. If you look at sunflower seed, safflower, and cottonseed oil, Russia and Ukraine together export close to 60% of these commodities in the world. You go down to wheat and muslin, you are close to 30%, around 26%. Barley, combined Russia and Ukraine, 24%, with 12% each. Linseed, Russia and Ukraine combined, 24%. Corn, Russia and Ukraine combined, 14%. Sunflower seed, 13%. Fertilizers, 14%. Now, these are figures from the International Trade Center, and they are 2020 figures. This is massive. And if Ukraine falls under Russian control, we will be dependent on Russia for a lot of our food. So apart from the fact that we're going to see spiraling inflation, we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing to create food resilience? The European Union figures are not much more cheerful. And, when it comes to vegetable oils, the share is about 26% of vegetable oils into the EU comes from Ukraine alone. Cereals, other than wheat and rice, 25%. Wheat is actually a little bit lower in the overall share of what comes into the European Union because we also have our own supplies. But the impact of disruption of supplies from Ukraine and Russia will be very consequential. And that is why it's important to think of alternatives and to start thinking of alternatives now. When it comes to wheat, to corn, things that we grow within the EU, the planting season is just starting. And I've actually just called a friend of mine who's head of a very large French farmers union. He hasn't answered me yet. I was hoping to get an answer before our podcast, but I was asking him whether they are beginning to think at this point of prioritizing certain crops to get more food resilience. There's also, of course, an interesting potential here for genetically modified food, which, of course, for politically in some countries is very problematic. But there is research going on at the moment to create food that has much, much higher nutrient content, particularly grains and oil-producing foods. And if people are interested, I could get hold of specialists in the area who are looking at these types of foods. And then we have all our other commodities: palladium, titanium, rare earths, rare metals, neon, which is used for engraving microchips for our mobile phones. 90% of neon comes out of Russia and Ukraine combined. So we're talking massive disruptions in an already very disrupted supply chain. So these impacts are much further than the direct military impact. And I think that what we are going to be seeing in the near and medium term future is serious reflection on creating more resilience for our commodities and for our food and for our energy supplies. And I haven't even mentioned oil and gas because that is so much in the headlines, but just to remind listeners that the EU depends on 40% of its gas imports come from Russia. Some countries will be hit harder than others in case of a disruption in supplies. Germany will be hit very hard, France a lot less hard. What is interesting is that the EU does not have a common purchasing policy for oil and gas. So each country has its own contracts. And these contracts are so secret that individual member states do not know how much the other country is paying for its gas, for instance. The only ones who know how much is being paid is the provider, and in this case, it's Russia. So it's a pretty big hold over us. And that's before we even go into potential disruptions that could be created by physical damage to the pipelines that go through Ukraine. And again, we are going to be looking at liquid natural gas from other supplies. We're going to be looking at gas coming from the Caucasus, from the Caspian Sea through the Caucasus. This again creates the potential for another flashpoint because these pipelines go through Georgia, which was invaded by Russia in 2008. And although the current Georgian government seems to be a little bit more compliant towards Russia, if Russia wants to get back at us for our sanctions, it could think about disrupting gas and oil supplies through Georgia, and then of course through Turkey. So there's a lot of it. I'm so sorry to be so pessimistic, but we need to be prepared to switch fast to alternative energy supplies and to alternative food supplies. And the only note of optimism that I would like to share is we have seen how fast we mobilized during the pandemic, both how fast we were able to implement sanitary measures and how fast we were able to develop a vaccine. So this makes me feel optimistic and makes me think that there are incredible opportunities for innovation, for accelerated R&D here, because if we don't do that, then we will continue to be at the mercy of non-democratic countries who want to impose their values on us. So there are massive opportunities here as well.
Just to summarise, faced with an existential threat to its economic well-being and seeing itself as having nothing more to lose, Russia will have several tools at its disposal with which to respond. One could be to limit the export of strategic resources to the West, like the ones the commodities you've just described. Having said that, these measures will be enormously expensive for Russia. So in the face of severe economic sanctions, and while still having the rumoured $630 billion in foreign reserves that can buoy the Russian economy for at least a few months, not necessary that it's something he would try his luck with right now.
Well, one likes to think so. We're not necessarily dealing with a rational actor here. And I would like to give you the example of Gazprom. Gazprom, which is Russia's gas monopoly, and it also has the monopoly not only on production, but on export of gas. Gazprom has been reducing its distribution of gas to the EU quite steadily since about the middle of last year. And at the beginning of the autumn, gas reserves in terminals that belong to Gazprom were at an all-time low. And there's an estimate that it's about a 13 billion cubic meter shortfall of gas. And this gas was not being diverted elsewhere in Russia or sold to other clients. It was being stored in Russia. There was no gain to be made here. With gas prices getting high, Russia had everything to gain by ensuring that more and more gas was being delivered to Europe, and it didn't. And now there are people who are analyzing this, who are wondering whether this was not part of a long-term plan to strangle us, and to show that to increase our dependency, and also to show that this regime, in certain cases, could be prepared to cut off its nose to spite its face. When it comes to rare earths and to metals, China is still a very big market. When it comes to food, Russia is going to need all the food that it can grow. It's not going to be importing very much. Its currency is worth nothing. It is not able to import anything anyway. So it's going to need its food. So that it shouldn't suffer too much from that. And as I said earlier in the previous podcast, if the Gulf states remain non-aligned, they will be continuing to import foodstuff from Russia and Ukraine, because that is where they get most of their grains from at the moment. So one should not necessarily expect rational behavior from Putin's regime right now.
So many supply chains and sectors are vulnerable. Many companies are and will experience issues. Any other areas that companies need to think about? What about supply chains and logistics?
Oh, transport and logistics, absolutely, because first of all, because of the cost of fuel. Also, if, for instance, parts of the Black Sea become unnavigable, and the Straits of Dardanelles, the Bosphorus, these are important transport hubs. Odessa is one of the most important cargo ports in the world, and it is very unlikely. Well, it's we speak, I think it's already fallen to the Russians, or at least there's a very big fight taking place there. But the most important threat that companies face right now is cyber threats, whether it's hacking, whether it is taking down things like taking down an electric grid, which Russia is capable of doing, or whether it's going so far as to completely taking down the internet, either through hacking or through physical attacks on the undersea cables that cross the Atlantic. And in January, there was an increased activity of Russian submarines in the Irish Sea, in the area where some of these vital cables are actually located. And that, of course, I don't know if one can imagine how the Western world would function without the internet. So in terms of contingency planning, companies need to start putting into place today, first of all, protection, whether it is online protection through strong firewalls, and I'm sure many already have. Also, saving data on non-cloud servers, data that can be accessed without having to access the internet. That is really important. Making sure there are sufficient landlines for basic communications. Making sure that there are plans in place so that people know who they have to talk to and where they need to go if they cannot reach people by phone. So, meeting points in companies, people who are responsible for coordinating this and who would be the contact point. We're talking about planning for war here, because in the 21st century, warfare is not just something that happens with tanks and guns on battlefields. Warfare happens in our homes through cyber and through information security. And I am currently writing an article in which I argue that World War III has just entered its military phase, but it has been going on since 2014 or 2008, depending on where you want to begin. And I actually noticed that Fiona Hill today, the former special advisor on Russia to President Trump, who testified against Trump in the impeachment hearings, has just said the same thing, that this is World War III. We've just now it's now entered a military phase. So another very important thing for companies and for individuals and families to bear in mind is if we come under a massive cyber attack that attacks our banks, we won't be able to use our credit cards. So it might be an idea to start thinking about withdrawing cash and keeping cash. And again, having plans in place with loved ones, what to do if we can't talk to each other on the phone. Where do we meet? How does this work? This does sound very dramatic, but I think it's better to be prepared. And I would rather people listen to this podcast in 6 months' time and say, "Oh my God, what a scaremongering idiot," than my predictions, than my advice to be of any use. I hope this is completely useless advice and that no one ever has to use it.
Indeed. But if America and its allies stay the course on economic sanctions, Russia could further escalate the conflict in other ways, and carrying out cyber attacks against the US and Europe is one way, like you've just described. So this pattern of tit for tat cyber retaliation could really place Russia and the West on a worrying path, and I think that's something that everyone in the world should be anxious to avoid. I think the purpose of carefully examining these potential post-invasion scenarios is not to argue that America and its allies should not impose no costs on Russia for an invasion, but to drive home the point that these countries will need to be extremely mindful to avoid triggering a situation of uncontrolled escalation with a major nuclear power, and one that happens to be a global supplier of critical materials. We've talked about what businesses are doing, which businesses and industries are vulnerable, and the possibility for cyber attack. Clearly imperative is to plan now, get backups, get clear on who does what. Next, we'll look at disinformation from Russia, climate considerations and trends emerging from this crisis. We're going to take a short break and be right back with my conversation with Samantha.
Interested in more insights on the current Russian-Ukrainian crisis? Visit our geopolitics hub at conferenceboard.org/topics/geopolitics. Here you can find a range of easily accessible insights in the form of webcasts, podcasts, research briefs, and more. New resources are being added regularly to help you lead with confidence.
Welcome back to Indications podcast. I'm your host, Sara Murry, Managing Director International of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Samantha De Bendern. Samantha, in an age of instant communication and powerful social media, what should business leaders be looking out for from Russian and Russian-funded disinformation? What are the short to medium-term goals for their disinformation efforts?
Well, the disinformation effort will be taking a number of shapes. First of all, to dampen our morale, and I fear that I may have unwittingly contributed to that by painting such a gloomy picture. But my objective is not to make people feel depressed. Is to make people realize what is happening and what can be done to build resilience. But they are going to want to start projecting images of all this doom and gloom. And if you are not friends with Russia, you're going to starve, and you're not even going to be able to drive your car. So I think would be really important for companies to start thinking of morale boosting activities for their staff. Secondly, vitally important would be training on recognizing disinformation. So if you get an image, if you get a tweet, if you get a Facebook post, how to decide whether this is a fake or not a fake, how to understand what a reliable source is or a non-reliable source. So before retweeting and before reposting on Facebook, because let's face it, companies are all staffed by individuals who, when they're not at work, have their own Instagram, Facebook, Twitter accounts, and will be relaying this information. And this will be contributing to Russia's attack against us. So, and this is something that could be cut. I mean, this needs to be covered by in-depth training, but understanding what disinformation is, the forms it can take. And to give you an example of the level of different levels of Russian disinformation, I'll give you two very extreme examples. The first example is the so-called treaties that were published in December 2021, when the Russians sent treaties on renegotiating European security to the United States and to NATO. This in itself was a disinformation exercise. Why? Because they presented to the world a desire to to renegotiate something that already existed. Fine. When you negotiate something and you produce a treaty, first of all, the counterpart has to know negotiation is taking place. When you draft a treaty, you actually draft it together with your counterparts, and you do not make it public until both sides are happy with the content. Russia created the illusion of having a treaty and the illusion of a negotiation. There was no negotiation taking place here. It was a big show to try and make the world believe something was happening that was not believing. It was an introduction on a grand scale of Russia's alternative reality. This is really important. So this is disinformation at the highest possible level, the level of heads of state, which then permeates society. Another level of disinformation, and this is an example that goes back to 2014, when I was working in Ukraine with the Ukrainian the Ukrainian Security and Defense Council, helping them combat disinformation. And I was a bit skeptical about the Ukrainians' tales of the level of disinformation coming out of Russia. And one morning I had this newspaper in front of me. There was a photograph of two men with Kalashnikovs. One of them was smoking a cigarette very nonchalantly, pointing the Kalashnikov at dead bodies in the middle of the street, civilians. And the headline said, these are dead bodies in the streets of Donetsk, the town in eastern Ukraine, being prodded indifferently by Ukrainian Nazis. Well, I knew that photograph. That photograph was taken in Sarajevo in 1995, and I actually know the photographer who took it. He's a very famous photographer. And I saw this photograph and I thought, this is not possible. They are taking this. To me, there was no doubt in my mind, because I knew I had seen this photograph so many times before, and the photograph had actually won prizes. It was such a sort of thumb in your face exercise in disinformation, because the Russians, when they did this, they knew that Western observers would see it, and they knew that everybody would recognize this photograph. And it was saying to us, we have no limits to what we can do with information. So this is an area where I would strongly urge companies to actually hire specialists to train their staff in recognizing disinformation. And I'm not saying that to plug any services, but I think it is vital in creating a response to the attack that Russia is going to subject us to in the next few months, particularly regarding their behavior in Ukraine.
Well, it's not just business, but also society that need to be more aware of what's going on. Zelensky's personal story has also helped to repudiate Putin's propaganda campaign that the first illegal invasion of a sovereign country is all down to ridding Ukraine of Nazis. He's from a Jewish family. His grandfather was one of 4 who survived the Holocaust. He himself pointed out, how can I be a Nazi? And then on another level, when you look at how the Russian disinformation campaign suggested that Zelensky had fled the capital. He got onto his phone, did a selfie video and said, I'm still here, I'm not going anywhere. So it's also interesting to observe how the Ukrainians are trying to dispel some of these disinformation efforts.
Yeah, I think one thing that's quite funny is, well, funny and also tragic is the image that Zelensky now has in the West. I mean, he is the world's hero, and I received a meme this morning, which was a warning to all men worldwide. Every woman you know has at least a small crush on Volodymyr Zelensky.
Absolutely, he is the hero of the day at the moment. Yeah. Anything else you believe companies need to prepare for or consider?
I think that all these companies are going to have Russian staff, Russian member of staff, in London, in the United States. I think it's very important that these Russian staff inside companies do not come in under any bullying threats, do not become marginalized, do not feel threatened. I think it's very important to explain to people that Putin is not Russia, and that most Russians abroad are actually appalled by what is happening. There will also, of course, be Russians who support the regime, and we have to continue respecting freedom of speech within our own companies, allow people to express themselves, and really just ensure that people are allowed to continue to live in safety, even if they represent a regime which is attacking the very fundamentals of our democracies.
Yeah. Anything else? What about, climate change? Anything on that we should be thinking
Absolutely.
about?
I thank you for reminding me, because this is something that is very important to remember. So, when it comes to energy supplies, you can't just switch over and build new pipelines tomorrow to other parts of the world where there would be significant oil and gas reserves. Qatar has actually said that yes, they're very happy to distribute LNG to Europe, but they have contracts to fulfill with other parts of the world, and they will reorient some supplies, but it cannot be done overnight. Germany, who declared a few years ago that it was going to close all its coal plants, is now thinking of recommissioning them. The likelihood that this will happen in other EU countries is very high, because we will need fuel. Luckily, we're reaching the end of the winter, so heating will not be so much of a problem, but the impact of what is happening, in my view, is likely to last well into next winter, if not beyond. And there is talk now of recommissioning coal pits. This is going to have a direct impact on emissions control, and is probably going to make many countries completely blow any of their carbon and CO2 emissions commitments. We are going to see, obviously, a turn towards nuclear. And France, even before the war began, said that it was committed to building 6 new nuclear plants. But then nuclear is all very well, but where do we get to buy the uranium? Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all countries which come under Russian control. Hopefully Ukraine won't. There are other sources of uranium. I mean, Canada is a very big one, certain countries in Africa, but Russia and Ukraine and the former Soviet Union are also big suppliers of uranium. Again, biofuels. It's all very well talking about biofuels, but when 90% of the world's rapeseed oil comes from the former Soviet space, where do we get our vegetable oils? So in the short term, we do not have many alternatives to fossil fuel to replace what we're going to be losing. So this will have an impact on climate change commitments, coming at a time when the UN has just released, not the UN, I've just saw the headline go by very briefly, but the climate change monitoring body just released a paper talking about the fact we've reached already catastrophic levels of CO2 emissions and global warming. Again, let's not get too depressed. This is an opportunity for accelerated R&D and accelerated development of alternative fuels. And I will say this again: we did it with vaccines. We should be able to do it with energy. And I do not want to end this podcast on a pessimistic note, which is why I really think this is important. There are opportunities here for companies to seize, not only to make money, but to actually improve the resilience of our societies. And the really important thing is to not sound trite, but to keep calm and carry on. The game isn't over in Russia either. There may come a time when people stop obeying orders. And although getting rid of Putin is not the home goal, because you still have a country where there are no democratic institutions, a lot will depend on who replaces him. But there is hope that this could also be the beginning of the end of Putin and of his despotic regime. And if that happens, and if in years to come, because it will take a long time for Russia to rebuild from this catastrophe, but we could potentially see new hope for cooperation across the Eurasian landmass, and have the same hope that we had in the early 1990s, but perhaps we would have all learned from our mistakes and build something even better, and what Gorbachev once called his common European home. So let's not all go away with too bleak a vision, because we will need to be resilient economically, physically, and also emotionally to get through this crisis.
Samantha, I think your phrase, keep calm and carry on, is the motto that we will take away with us after talking today. We've talked trends that will accelerate energy strategy and policy, food self-sufficiency, xenophobia, cyber attacks, the need for backup plans, saving data on non-cloud-based services, the need for strong firewalls, If the internet breaks down, how will we communicate? Bring the landlines back. Encourage employees to think about how they will communicate with their loved ones in the event of a telecommunications breakdown. We've also talked about the importance of thinking about cash reserves. Equally important is how do we look after our Ukrainian and Russian employees? This is a tough time right now. Samantha, thank you for joining us and providing our listeners with a roundup of insights on the state of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And thanks to all of you for listening in to the Indications podcast. Every few weeks, I'll be joined by experts to provide insights on this issue. Please share this Indications podcast with your colleagues. You can find it on the conferenceboard.org website /podcasts and on all major podcast applications. I'm Sara Murry, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.